I mentioned before that Teddy Roosevelt was very much in favor of conservationism, and I pointed out there's a difference between conservationism and preservationism. Under President Roosevelt, conservationism wasn't just a good idea, it became public policy. Laws were passed, rules were put in place so as to promote conservation. The difference between conservationism and preservationism, as I said before, was preservationists want to take wilderness areas and set them aside untouched. Conservationists, on the other hand, want to conserve natural resources. That doesn't mean they don't want to use them at all. Conservationists believed that conservation and development could go hand in hand. But the idea was to be practical, use long-term planning, and be rational in how you did use natural resources so that you didn't use them all up, right? So that you conserved some of them for future generations. As I said, that's a fairly new idea. For most of American history, there had been this concept that there's this big, huge continent out there with limitless resources, so just use them up. But that was no longer something that was sustainable by this time. Roosevelt was a big proponent of the national park system, opened a lot of national parks, and set aside a lot of nature areas during his administration. He's not the one who came up with that idea. There were natural parks before he ever took office. But like I said, he really pushed the idea. The idea of having this place with natural beauty to which people could go, and people like Roosevelt believed, toughen yourself up, right? That city life softens you, so that you need some wilderness experience, and that wilderness needs to be there. I have there a question mark next to natural beauty, because the question is, and you probably never thought about this before, but national parks in particular, and also nature reserves, are they really completely natural? Are they untouched? Not really. In various different ways, these areas are sculpted by and controlled by someone, in particular the government. Also, during the Progressive era, there were a lot of difficulties concerning the regulation of water, especially in the American Southwest, which is a very arid region, and a lot of towns had been established in areas where there was limited water available. And in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of these towns' populations started growing and growing and growing, so that the cities eventually became much larger than they had been before in context with their available resources. This was especially a problem in California. In fact, in the 19-teens and 1920s, there was this series of events called the Water Wars in California, in which the city of Los Angeles, and in particular some investors, diverted water away from lakes in other parts of the state so that the people of Los Angeles would have enough water. This affected the environment. This affected the ability of farmers who had been living near those lakes and using that water to make a living. So it was very problematic. All that aside, that is to say, the politics and the problematic nature of the water wars, the fact that you've got the government involved in preserving wildlife, building national parks, regulating water in arid regions, all that fits in real well with the overall goals of people in the Progressive era, which is, overarchingly, a desire for the governments to control things and to regulate things. And in these aspects, that even went so far as to include nature itself. In 1908, Roosevelt chose not to run for re-election. The tradition had always been serve 2 terms and then leave and let someone else take over. Roosevelt had served not 2 full terms, but almost 2 full terms, because McKinley was not in office very long when he died, and so he followed the tradition, stepped aside. In the election, the Democratic Party once again chose William Jennings Bryan. It had sort of become a habit by this point. The Republican Party chose William Howard Taft, who had been the Secretary of War, what we today call the Secretary of Defense, during Roosevelt's second term. Taft was Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. He believed that Taft would continue his own policies and continue his own efforts to control monopolies. Well, Taft wound up winning. There never was a President Bryan, as often as he tried to make that so. Here's a cartoon from the time showing the perception of Teddy Roosevelt's feelings about the whole thing. Here he is getting ready to leave the White House, go off on safari, as it turns out, and he's handing over his baby, that is his policies, to Taft, who's wearing a maid's outfit, to denote that basically Taft is a babysitter for Roosevelt's policies. Roosevelt is entrusting them to him in his absence. Well, did the new president follow through on the approaches of Roosevelt? Initially, he certainly did. He continued Roosevelt's policy of trust busting. In 1911, broke up Standard Oil, dealing a blow to Rockefeller, which was one big, huge oil company that, as a result of this breakup, was divided into more than 30 smaller companies. Now, some of these companies you've probably heard of, like, for example, Exxon, Amoco, Mobil, Chevron. In most cases, not the initial names they took, but names that they later adopted. Just imagine all those companies and more if they were one big company. And that is exactly how it was when Standard Oil was in operation. Once the oil company was divided, actually, in these smaller subsidiary companies that took its place, stocks doubled. A lot more people started investing. Why? Because now that there's not a monopoly, now that there are 36 smaller companies competing with one another to get customers, it's going to be better for the customers, and they're all going to actually make more money, or at least one of them is going to wind up making, some of them will wind up making more money than others. So if you wanted to invest and gamble in which one of those would come out on top, then you had a chance of making a lot of money yourself. Something similar was done with the American Tobacco Company, or the Tobacco Trust. It was broken into 4 smaller companies, including R.J. Reynolds. This time it didn't work as well, because the 4 smaller companies continued to work together behind the scenes and coordinate what they were doing, so they acted like they were still one big company. Basically, then the tobacco industry went from being controlled by a monopoly to an oligopoly, or ruled by a small minority. However, despite that, ex-President Roosevelt, felt that Taft wasn't going far enough, that he was not trying hard enough to control big business, and that he was, in fact, dropping the ball, and there was even, some hint that he was in collusion with some of the big businesses that he didn't go after, at least on the part of Roosevelt. So this cartoon shows the relationship of the two men toward the end of Taft's administration, when Roosevelt had come back from his extended safari. Uncle Sam, you see, is watching on while the two of them beat the crap out of each other. All this leads us to the 1912 election. It winds up being a very interesting and very important election, with basically 4 parties represented. You have Taft running for re-election with the Republican nomination. Roosevelt had tried to get the nomination. He's decided, I decided to quit after 2 terms. I wish I hadn't done that. I'm coming back and trying again, but he didn't get the nomination. So he formed his own third party, the Progressive Party. And then you had Woodrow Wilson on the Democratic side, and once again Eugene Debs for the American Socialist Party.